Exactly 1 month ago, the U.S. military sent the United States Army Observer Group in Yan'an to investigate the communists. According to members of the mission, their role was to gauge communist military and intelligence strength, establish a connection with the communist leadership, and to gain more accurate information concerning communist-controlled China and Soviet influence on the area. Let's head out to the leader of this mission, Colonel David Barrett, live from Yan'an, the communist headquarters, to hear about how the communist military force could assist us against the Japanese. Colonel Barrett, what have you learned so far on your mission?
Thanks, Mike. It immediately became apparent that as sources of information about the Japanese, the communists were all we had hoped they would be, and even more. Particularly valuable as sources of intelligence were the Japanese prisoners of war in Yan'an. There were about 150 of them, a number which seemed impressive to me in comparison with the 25 or so held by the national government just outside Chongqing. They were apparently eager to do all they could to help us. They gave us a great deal of valuable information on a number of subjects about which we wished to learn. The communists were also of great assistance to us in collecting weather reports of vital importance to our Navy and Air Force.
Thanks, Colonel Barrett. It seems our military and the communists seem to be getting along quite well. Quite a turnaround from our previous steadfast support of the Kuomintang. Alright, that's all for tonight. Until next time, I'm Michael Margette with ABC World News. CBS News presents Carter Murray.
The nationalist government would certainly be preferable to this country's current regime. Since his violent takeover in China, Mao has proved himself to be a loyal proxy of the communist government in Russia. Last year, his pamphlet on People's Democratic Dictatorship outlined his plans to give Soviets a privileged position in the region. Between that, his expulsion of diplomats, and the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance from February of this year, it's clear that Mao is no friend to the Americans. Going off that, what, if anything, could the U.S. government do or have done to prevent the loss of China?
Let's try to stay optimistic here, Carter. Chang just launched what we hope will be a successful attack on Mao's forces, but to answer your question, the U.S. expended significant economic and strategic resources to bolster the nationalist position. We sent to Chang first $27.7 million and later $400 million, in addition to the Army Advisory Group to offer military advice. The China White Paper, published last year, showed just how much energy the U.S. put into saving China from the menace of communism. Our biggest mistake was not catching it early enough. I will say this, if Mao does successfully establish his communist government, this civil war marks the end of friendly relations between our nation and China as an extension of Soviet evil.
NBC News presents Ethan Hyman.
America has a new enemy. Just a couple of months ago, the American armed forces seemed destined for defeat at Busan. Then General MacArthur made his improbable amphibious landing at Incheon and changed the tide of the war. But then, last week, as the American forces were approaching the Yalu River, the Chinese shocked the world and poured over the border between China and North Korea. For a week, the Chinese pushed American forces back and then suddenly disappeared. We go over to our site reporter in Korea for more information.
Hi there to all the folks back home. We're here in Korea after the Americans have been shocked 2 times this week when the Chinese forces poured into the Korean peninsula and then suddenly disappeared. Even though this is the first instant of the Chinese Communist forces moving in large numbers into the Korean peninsula, some estimate as many as 150,000 Chinese troops that were there have been Chinese volunteers fighting alongside the North Koreans throughout the duration of this conflict. Many people here in the intelligence community were aware of the dangers of pushing so close to China's border, but were not expecting such a massive invasion so swiftly and quickly. Now, back to you on the home front.
Thanks for that report. This is the second time in almost 3 years that the Americans have had a conflict of interests with the Chinese Communist Party. While the last time, in the Chinese Civil War, there was no direct conflict between American and Chinese forces. This time, the differences between the Americans and Chinese were met on the battlefield. Does the United States have a new enemy? I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Now we turn to a story that has captured our attention for years, the military tensions in Vietnam. We have learned that since 1956, China has been sending massive amounts of aid to Vietnam, including munitions and over 100,000 engineering troops, to build up infrastructure. A more startling finding is the number of anti-aircraft artillery troops deployed by China. The Chinese government claims to have shot down 1,707 American planes through March of this year in what they claim to be their airspace. The U.S. now has nearly 600,000 troops stationed in South Vietnam and appears prepared for full-on war. We now bring in an expert on the conflict, Baxter Johansson Malloy. Baxter, what insight can you provide us on the conflict and what it might mean going forward?
Thank you for having me. It is critical when analyzing this conflict to understand the U.S.-China dynamic. The U.S. seems to have the goal of containing China's influence in spreading communism. Chinese General Lo Ruiqing has stated China's intention to support a North Vietnamese invasion of the South. In addition, he promised that China would defend North Vietnam if U.S. ground troops attack North Vietnam. Both the U.S. and China would like to avoid an armed conflict. China has held put through Operation Rolling Thunder. The U.S. is poised to protect South Vietnam at all costs, with the 570,000 ground troops.
Baxter, what are the implications of South Vietnam falling to the communists?
Well, in the event that Vietnam were to fall to communism, U.S. officials are confident that their hold on other bases in the Pacific, such as Guam, Okinawa, and the Philippines, as well as Japan, would allow them to maintain a hold in Asia.
Baxter, I just received some news from our headquarters. Folks, we have breaking news. A leak from the CIA has revealed that relations between China and North Vietnam have soured. China is pulling out forces of North Vietnam. Baxter, I realize this is very much on the spot, but why do you think that this is happening, and what could this mean for the future?
Well, I think China's involvement with North Vietnam took on a sort of imperialistic appearance. China may have been too eager to use North Vietnam for political gains, and I believe North Vietnamese officials sensed this and decided to split with China. I have learned that the Soviet Union has started pumping aid into North Vietnam, so this may have provided them a sense of security in splitting with China. I believe the U.S. will fight off North Vietnam, because U.S. officials are intent on preventing the spread of communism.
I'm here outside the White House, where President Richard Nixon has just returned from his historic trip to the People's Republic of China, facilitated by the work of National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, who worked tirelessly to make this trip happen. Kissinger's work also included ending United States support of Taiwan. Nixon, on the other hand, during this trip, was able to meet with Zhou Enlai, which Nixon referred to as a turning point in history. And indeed it seems as if that is true. After a few days of formal negotiations and friendly gestures, an agreement was made in the Shanghai Communique, an agreement that reduces United States military presence in Asia in exchange for peace. Things are looking good in the East, and I'm glad to have the Commander-in-Chief back in the West Wing.
Finally, China and the U.S. have found a common enemy. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan not only altered the Carter administration's initial attempt of a cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it also has caused the U.S. military policy to strategically shift towards China. After the invasion, China aligned itself with Pakistan and the United States and declared the Afghanistan crisis was important and couldn't be separated from the Soviet military encirclement issue. Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping urged that China and the U.S. should do something in a down-to-earth way so as to defend world peace. President Carter agreed, noting that there is essential agreement between the U.S. and China with regards to strategic interests, particularly as they relate to Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Kampuchea. In fact, in January, President Carter instructed Secretary of Defense Harold Brown that during his visit to Beijing, he should propose U.S. sales of non-lethal military equipment to the PRC, including ground telecommunication stations that could receive data from U.S. satellites. This reinforced the Chinese leader's perception of a new anti-Soviet direction in U.S. policy, showing the beginning of a more friendly U.S.-China military relationship. Chinese leaders were satisfied that the U.S. had recognized the dangers of restraint and concession, and abandoned its policy of appeasement and accommodation.
Welcome to the news today, July 26, 1996. This just in response to Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui's controversial visit to the U.S., the PRC has begun extensive munitions testing and military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. So far, dozens of missiles have been launched into the sea, a clear intimidation technique, as well as a simulated invasion on the coast opposite of Taiwan. The PRC is upset that Congress voted to give a visa to President Lee Teng-hui, president of the officially unrecognized government of China in exile in Taiwan, after direct promises from the Clinton administration that the visa would not be granted. The White House has declined to comment. These blatant attempts to punish the U.S. and Taiwan were announced several weeks ago, but no one expected the PLA to follow through with the threats. The People's Liberation Army is in the midst of a naval buildup, but the U.S. has decided to come to Taiwan's aid by flexing its muscles in the biggest show of force in the Pacific theater since the Vietnam War. 2 carrier task forces, the Navy's strongest attack units, have sailed to the area, with one actually sailing directly through the Taiwan Strait itself. Top analysts believe that even though this event has increased tensions between the U.S. and the PRC, it has galvanized the U.S. in its resolve to promote stability in the East, as well as the world, by bringing China into world leadership and global organizations as a way to keep the People's Republic of China from acting in ways that affect the world and the world order. And that's the news tonight.